I think in these sort of post-COVID times, coming together face-to-face still feels like a treat, and so I was really pleased to have the invitation from Anne-Marie to come and spend time with ARK this week and to give this lecture, and to talk about the work that we've done around social care in the 4 parts of the UK. So this wasn't work that I did on my own, this is work with my colleague collaborator Patrick Hall, who both at the University of Birmingham. So what we did in this piece of research was we were really interested in looking at comparisons over the 20 years since that kind of devolution period. If we take kind of 1998 as that kind of start point for this kind of devolution experience, then we've got about 25 years of data looking at kind of what they'd done around social care, what was working, what some of the lessons were across those 4 areas. And recognising, of course, that this isn't like for like, but the much greater population size of England does mean it does get in the way of kind of neat comparisons, and we also know that the devolution settlements are not in any way symmetrical, and there are distinctive features in all 4, and nothing in England, in fact. The research was mainly interview-based, so we got started before COVID and came over to Belfast and did some work here, but a lot of it was done during COVID as well, so a lot of that was online. And then we also, when we were interviewing people, asked them to tell us what they thought were some of the key policy documents or pieces of legislation that had been published in that period, and so we also looked at those to understand how social care was being framed and what some of the kind of key policy recommendations and policy and legislation was. And for people who are interested in such things, we took a critical realist lens, so that was our kind of assumption, that we were really interested in the interpretations that policy actors were giving, and that we didn't necessarily recognise those as, we recognised that they were interpretations, but we felt that they had kind of, they were talking about real social phenomena. So we located this in the context of social care in crisis, which is one of those words that kind of is overused in many ways, because the idea of a crisis is things come to a head, and actually things have just kind of rumbled on now, being in a bad state for a long time. But in particular, we were interested in the notion of kind of separating out 5 care crises. So a crisis of demand, and then the others are kind of crisis of supply, if you like, in terms of the supply of care. So a crisis of demand, so more people coming into social care. So social care, talking about support for frail older people, for people, working age people with disability, for people with a long-term mental health condition, and we are talking about adults in our research, so recognising that there is a whole other work around children, but we are focused on adults. So we know about the kind of demographic challenges here. Some of this is around increased longevity for people with lifelong disabilities, population ageing. These are things to celebrate, but they also mean that the kind of post-war welfare settlement is no longer really fit for purpose in terms of thinking about what kind of support people want to live a good life, which is what social care is all about. And so partly that's because the institutions that have been providing care are all of themselves under strain. So we characterise that as in part a crisis of family, so we know that kind of family structures don't look in some ways how they used to, and that things like population movement, changing workforce patterns means that there is not necessarily the same kind of expectations around family care as there once was. Again, lots of that is something to celebrate because there were very problematic gendered elements to that. But nonetheless, in terms of availability of care, that's part of what's going on here. It is important, though, to stress that the vast, vast majority of care is still done by the family. And I know we've got Craig here from Carers Northern Ireland. We know that families do an awful lot, and that lots of people are under enormous strain in families. So it's not that the family is absent; the family is still doing a lot. But it's in recognition of, of kind of the strains that places, the kind of sense of people on the edge, people in crisis. It's partly about the crisis of the state and how much the state should and does act in the social care space. So I've got some figures coming up around funding, but we know that there's a real kind of pressure here around inadequate funding. The funding has not matched demand. It does not necessarily match the kinds of services that people want to have either. We know that there's not been sufficient investment in workforce and in creating good jobs in social care, so all of these are state responsibilities. But I think it's a bit like with the family, it's partly a question of too little and partly a question of too much. I think there's also a difficult historical legacy of state care, and that locking people up in institutions, for example, was not something that's a kind of a history to be proud of. And we know that there are still ongoing scandals related to that legacy that's still really here with us today. So it's not like there was a kind of golden era of state provision which we've gone past. We need to kind of recognise that that's a difficult history as well. I think there's a crisis of the market, that as the state has done less around social care, often that gap has been filled by the market, by which here I mean for-profit and not-for-profit provision, and some of that is good, but some of it is poor quality, and some of it does not create a good experience for the people receiving care or for the workers. And some of that is a very unstable situation and doesn't give the kind of continuity and stability that people want from social care services. I think there's also something here around the crisis of community, that kind of broader sense of kind of voluntary community space, the things that people do in their lives that help give them meaning and also give them the kinds of care and support in social relations, which support some of maybe the more preventative elements of social care. And we know that the kind of strain on community resources has been intense. We know that there's been kind of closures in lots of resources. So that's again a kind of part of the community, a part of the social care provision, in which there's a sense of crisis. But I think there is an ambiguity around kind of what we want from social care provision, because in a sense that in some ways we're saying that these institutions are doing too much, and in some ways we're doing too little. And it's probably only community where we could perhaps all come together and say that there's something good there, but we know again that community can have its dark side. So if we look then at some of the demographic materials and what the kind of data tells us around how social care and social care demand and populations look in the four nations. So we can see here, so Northern Ireland, in all these graphs, Northern Ireland is the kind of the larger dashes, so here it's shown at the bottom. So this is showing over that kind of 20-year period that we've got ageing populations in all four nations, that Wales has got the highest proportion of older people in its population. I think this is an over 65 graph, and that Northern Ireland has had a younger population, but it's still on the same kind of trajectory. In terms of disability prevalence, again we can see there's a bit more kind of volatility in Wales, and I guess a graph of that shape makes you think that perhaps there's something going on around the data there. But we can see again a slight increase in general around disability prevalence in the four nations. In terms of public spending on adult social care, so we can see here that this is a graph where we see Northern Ireland with those bigger dashes performing higher, certainly by the time we get to the end of the period, than the other four nations. And here it's England that's really the outlier, but that kind of period of austerity in England is kind of coming from a lower base, but is also sustained at a low level over this period. So if we look at kind of per head spending, this is public spending on care, so it doesn't take into account self-funding of care, but that we can see there that Northern Ireland is just slightly higher, but it's England there that's the real outlier. The next graph shows, it really demonstrates how this is divided up between people of working age and older adults. So we can see in England it's about half and half. When we look at Northern Ireland and Scotland, we can see that older people are a higher proportion of that total public expenditure. So in Scotland, that's to do with its free personal care. In Northern Ireland, I suspect that's to do with the charging for domiciliary care. We would see that pattern here. Then on the next graph, we can see here, so this is the numbers, so rather than the per head spend, this is giving us something around how many people we've got in each of these categories. So for some reason England is divided on this from in between short term and long term, so we want to detain ourselves with that particularly, but it's giving you it's showing you that older people are a much bigger population, so that's not necessarily reflecting the spend, because we spend less on older people per head, but in terms of numbers we can see that older people are very much the biggest population. in terms of social care. And the outlier here is Scotland, which I think relates, as I said, to that context of free personal care, which older people can have, which pushes that number much higher than some of the other parts. And then the final statistic page is just around direct payments, which I know there's been some great research done on from some colleagues here around this in Northern Ireland. And I think the key kind of interesting thing here is we start from a very low base, with legislation passed to make direct payments lawful in the 90s, but that it's been a kind of a slow climb in England, so that England with the highest numbers, with methods changed, and actually the stats have shown that it's starting to go down again, so there's no sense, I think, certainly in England, of a kind of growing momentum around direct payment spending, so this is where people are giving the money directly to make their own care choices, that we can see that the Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland have been lower, but the Northern Ireland is starting to climb up here quite sharply, whereas you can see certainly Scotland, after a little spike around the time of the Self-Directed Support Act, has then gone back down and remains at a very low level. So that's some of the kind of contextual background to give you a sense of what kind of social care looks like, who's getting social care, how much is being spent in each of the four areas. And I think what we can see from that and from our interviews and our document analysis is that there is a sense of crisis in all four of the UK nations, but that's experienced kind of differently. It's a kind of crisis with a different sort of flavour and context in the four. So certainly in England, where we saw that lower per head spend, this is often talked about as a crisis of austerity that is linked to, I think, the kind of financial crash, the incoming Conservative coalition government in 2010, and the lack of investment since then in public services, exacerbated by COVID and Brexit. I think in Scotland and Wales there's been a bit more kind of positive action, I'll talk about that in a minute, around social care, but nonetheless there are issues there which I talked about much more in terms of demand and also of workforce issues. I think in Northern Ireland, of course, the lack of political activity has made it difficult to make progress on social care and to kind of bring some of the legislation up to the levels we see in other parts of the UK. So that's when people talk about the crisis, that's the first thing really that people talk about. And so we can see in that sense, because people are talking about a slightly different kind of crisis or giving a different flavour to the crisis, the sorts of solutions that they're talking about have a slightly different flavour or different emphasis. And certainly we would see, so I would say in the Wales and Scotland interviews, there was more optimism about the potential of the state to be the engine of change and improvement, a more kind of social democratic version of the welfare state and social care, whereas in England it was much more about kind of the market will save us if only we can just tweak the model and make sure that we can get the kind of the provider side, we can sort of stabilise the market, and that's really where the solution to the crisis will come. And I think I was looking back at the Power to People report this morning, which I guess was one of the last perhaps big policy statements around social care that I'm aware of from Northern Ireland, and I think what they talked about in 2017 was a system collapsing in slow motion, and I guess we're now 7 years on from that, and I guess we probably all have a bit of a sense of that that's continued, that the kind of trajectory hasn't changed, and that somehow we're all still kind of staggering along with a system that feels on the edge of collapse, and if it doesn't collapse, it's often because of the very heroic interventions of people on the front line. People, professionals and care workers and others who hold it together. So from what we could see in the care policy documents, what was kind of interesting, I think, was that in all four of the areas of the UK, the kind of endpoint of good care policy was actually very similar. So the kinds of narratives that were being used around what's social care for, what's it trying to get us to, were very similar across all four. So this kind of idea of well-being was foregrounded in a lot of the documents, that there was a clear sense of, particularly as we got towards the sort of and more recent documents that social care is not an end in itself. Social care is about good lives, it's about flourishing, it's about well-being. Quite a few of the nations have got different kind of measures in place to measure well-being. There's also an articulation around fairness, and there's different kinds of fairness in there. So sometimes it's about the fairness of who pays for social care. You know, how do we kind of do that fairly? You know, there's a kind of tax-based narrative around fairness, there's the kind of risk pooling, or there's a kind of articulation of if you're a wealthy person in a large house, it's fairer if you pay for your own care rather than the state paying it for you. So there's different kinds of accounts of fairness that are in there. But I think a sense at the moment that too much of social care is a lottery, and that does not make for good public services, that there should be a fair allocation of this. It shouldn't depend on just the look of where you happen to live or who you happen to get in terms of providing care. There's a strong articulation of rights. I think we find this strongest in the Scottish documents, where human rights has been a bigger part, I think, of their articulation of what good social care is for, what public services should achieve. And so thinking then about the kind of the rights of people receiving care, but also the rights of people working in care, the right to a good job, for example, fair work, making sure that this is a system that works for everybody. There's something around quality, and so we can see that through the kind of regulatory systems that are put in place to assure quality, through the kind of the ways in which the workforce is regulated, trying to think about quality, and we can kind of see that, I guess, through coming at sort of two different ends of the telescope. Partly that can be about national standards and the enforcement of standards through the regulatory process. And then I think we could also potentially see this as around how people themselves define quality, because what makes a good life for you and kind of what makes a quality care experience can be subjective. And so it's thinking about, are we kind of, you know, how do we bring that into our understanding of quality care? And then there's something around sustainability, which I guess perhaps increasingly has a bit of a kind of environmental edge to it, but I think what I'm particularly talking about in the book is how do we keep this show on the road? How do we keep the kind of the market, as it's certainly be called in England, how do we make that sustainable? How do we make sure that we kind of stabilise provision, that it's sufficient, it's of good quality, and that this is a system that can keep going, and it kind of moves out of this sense of kind of collapsing in slow motion. And so in the work we found kind of 6 mechanisms, so 6 specific policies which we thought were trying to achieve these overarching goals. So the first of that was around redistributing the costs. So we know that for kind of historic reasons around the creation of the NHS and the National Assistance Act in the 1940s, that social care was left there at that point to local government, and it was left to means-tested services. It wasn't part of the NHS package. And that increasingly, therefore, we've got this kind of a set of arrangements for care which have become increasingly problematic. So certainly in England, big debate around self-funding and the lack of any kind of cap on self-funding, and that people can be liable for very high care costs. If you're somebody who's in who's got dementia in residential care for a long time, that can be an extremely high care cost, and that we don't treat we don't expect people to bear the cost of their own health, the kind of health risks, and so why do we think that it's okay for people to have no cap on their liability for care risks? So there's something there around how we get that balance between what should be state-funded through taxation, what people should pay for themselves, how people should top up. And I think with Scotland moving to free personal care since 2003 for older people and now for working age people as well, then there is a kind of model in the UK for a different way of doing it. So that doesn't cover your accommodation costs in residential care, but it does cover your care costs if you do at home or in care home. And so that obviously does give us a kind of model of a different way of doing things. I think what's quite interesting when we were doing the work, and perhaps we'll get into this in the discussion afterwards, was that in England, Wales and Scotland, the talk is really about how we minimise self-funding. So in England, that's around putting a cap on care costs, which we've had legislated for twice, but doesn't look like it's going to happen. In Wales, it's about a maximum weekly charge for home care and raising the means test for residential care. In Scotland, we've got free personal care, and whereas in Northern Ireland, the power to people and the consultation that came after it was about increasing the pool of self-funders by charging for domiciliary care. So I thought that was quite an interesting I guess, move in a slightly different direction than the direction we're seeing in the other parts of the UK. There's something around personalisation or self-directed support, around thinking about how do we put the person at the centre, how do we move away from very kind of time and task-based models where we just see people as needing things, functional tasks done for them. How do we put the person at the centre and think much more creatively about what makes a good life for somebody? How do we personalise their support? So we can see the Self-Directed Support Act in Scotland around that. There's not articulated in quite the same way, but a similar kind of drive around self-direction in Wales, and I think that language is used increasingly in Northern Ireland as well. In England, we call it personalisation. It's got, I think, a bit more of a market flavour, but nonetheless, it comes from, I think, the same idea of how do we put the person at the centre, how do we increase things like direct payments so people can make their own choices around care, and that we don't necessarily default straight to a care package and assume that people have a standardised set of needs. There's something about supporting unpaid carers, so the family and friends who sit around the person who needs care. So in the other parts of the UK, there is a right to meet the needs of carers, and that's increasingly to be treated alongside and equivalent to the person being cared for. That isn't, as I understand it, currently the legislative position in Northern Ireland, that there's a right to assessment but not to meet the needs following assessment. So again, I think we have been seeing an increased support for carers. We've got higher carers allowance now in Scotland as well, but that there are differences across the board in terms of how far that's gone. The prevention agenda is also kind of one of the mechanisms here of the sort of shift left, as I've heard it called when we came to Northern Ireland, around kind of investing more in both health and social care prevention, so that we're kind of investing upstream to stop people needing to come in to the care system. This has been talked about, it's been legislated for in Scotland, in Wales and in England, but it remains elusive, I think, because of the sense of the system under such strain, that I think you need a little bit of slack in the system to really take the time to invest early, put those things in place. So I think it's much more talked about than done, but nonetheless there is this commitment to saying we recognise that if we can kind of support people well in their own home, we can kind of keep them embedded in the networks that give them a good life and that also meet some of their kind of care needs, then we're prolonging the period where they can live independently. Maybe we're providing the right kind of housing for people to live independently, and we're stopping people coming into these state services of which we really cannot build enough, create enough. We've not got the workers, we've not got the infrastructure. It's in this space, this early intervention space, that we're really going to kind of crack this. And so there's a real commitment to do that where possible. Integration with health. We love that, don't we? That's just integrate with health. If we can make that work, then we'll recognise that people are not kind of a separate set of health needs over here and social care needs over here. But the systems have generally been separate. It's been very difficult, I think, through a number of different attempts at integration to really get social care to be an equal player at the table. That often integration ends up being more dominated by the acute trusts, by the health side of the partnership, and so I think there was, when we were doing the book, we were interested to look over at Northern Ireland to see, well, you guys have been doing integration for years. How do we do it better? What can we learn? And I guess the analysis that we were seeing coming out of Northern Ireland was, we've got a similar kind of set of problems. We're also having problems, having integration here hasn't meant we can get people out of hospital into care packages in a smooth way. It hasn't dealt with the workforce issues. There's still this sense that sort of social care gets a bit of money at the end if there's any left over, but it's not really the main deal in town. So I think we keep, so in England now, we're on a whole new set of structures around integrated care systems and trying to make integration work. But I think what perhaps gets forgotten is that there are bits of social care which are butt really closely to health, and where it does really make sense to think of people in that holistic way. And maybe that is for a frail older person who's broken a hip and then is coming out of hospital. Maybe that's the bit where they kind of interface. But there's lots of bit of social care, about living a good life with a disability that's actually not that much to do with the NHS. And if we kind of assume that everything from social care has to be sort of bundled up into something that also the NHS recognises as part of its world, then we kind of, in a way, we dilute and we distract from, that kind of business of good lives and put people at the centre. And this one around professionalising the workforce, so trying to bring in a kind of a workforce in social care which has more of the kind of NHS style terms and conditions, pay, training, the sort of structures that people would recognise for that workforce. And again, I think this is unfinished business, and there's somewhat of an ambivalence here around kind of what we want out of social care. So England has currently no registration or regulation of care workers, so in that sense England is the outlier here because there is something of that kind in, as you know, in Northern Ireland. In Scotland, in Wales it's qualifications based, it's not in Northern Ireland, and in Scotland you're required to get a qualification within 5 years of being on a register. We don't have registers generally for personal assistance, and there's been some kind of pushback from the disability rights movement that actually the last thing that they kind of want the personal assistant to be is a kind of a nurse by any other name. People want the freedom to work with who they want to work with. They want people who can support them in a whole range of ways of their life, and actually some of the kind of basic and functional needs is only a tiny part of that, and we need to not kind of turn this into a kind of quasi-health profession. So I think that's important. The converse of that, of course, is that we want these to be good jobs. We want to recognise the level of skill which is required for these jobs, the emotional labour of these jobs. We need to recognise that in the pay, training and progression, and we're still a long way off doing that. So those then are the kind of mechanisms, and as I say, it's interesting that all 6 of those are active in all 4 parts of the UK, but they do have different places are at different stages in terms of implementation, in terms of what they prioritise. So because we were taking a kind of realist approach, we provided some context, we thought about those mechanisms, and then we said, well, let's look at outcomes. And actually that was really tricky because there is a real lack of outcomes data in the social care space. So there are some kind of surveys that are very difficult to compare across the 4 nations. And there's been an increased recognition of the difficulty of kind of measuring outcomes in this space, and certainly comparing them, and so recognition from a couple of recent reports around the kind of the need to do more around social care outcomes, this idea of not so much a gap as a chasm in terms of our understanding. And it was interesting, again looking at that back at Power to People report, that there's a line there about that they're kind of expressing awareness about outcomes-based social care, and I think a bit like saying that you're sceptical about health integration, which I am personally. It's a bit to say that you're sceptical about outcomes-based approaches. I think is also quite heretical, and I'm sure that's something we can get into a discussion about afterwards. But certainly attempts to move commissioning and contracting into that outcomes-based space have been really tricky, and I know there's various things like social impact bonds which have been tried. But generally I think that's been a sort of disappointing legacy to date. So we know that kind of social care should be about outcomes, but writing a contract that kind of makes that meaningful and really kind of makes it kind of effective, I think is still quite elusive. So yeah, it'd be good to perhaps talk about how we might make social care more outcomes based. And I guess just the other bit of outcome data, which is kind of problematic to compare. We've only got one data point that spotted well for Northern Ireland, is around satisfaction with social care services. And I think what's quite staggering to me for this is that 90% of people using social care services in England think they're report that they're okay, that they sort of agree or strongly agree. Now, I suspect this is taken from I haven't looked at this for a while, but I think from the Department of Health survey of people using social care services. So I think, and this relates to a conversation we were having with colleagues earlier today, that might be about expectations, that people have very low expectations around social care. And I think there's some digging around to find out where we've got that gulf between, say, the English figures and then that one Northern Ireland data point. But certainly more recent data around, say, British social attitudes would show very much lower levels of overall satisfaction, so not just people who use care services, but from the kind of community at large and the population at large around how satisfied they are with social care services. And in health and social care, that's about halved during and after COVID, so there's been a real drop-off around that. So where did this all take us to to then, so then we have our kind of, we call our sort of summative assessment, the kind of ranking, who's best, where should you go and live, and the answer is Scotland. Scotland had the best combination of active legislation in this space, reform on a number of agendas, and sort of tangible increases in things like carers allowance, the free personal care context. So a sense that Scotland was the sort of leader of the pack in this space. That Wales was moving in similar directions, but its kind of very weak constitutional settlement from 1998 meant about the first decade was really spent on building the institutions in Wales, and therefore it was really only with, say, the Social Services and Wellbeing Act in 2013 that they were really able to kind of get going, and have been watching Scotland closely and kind of looking and kind of learning about what's possible. In England, we can see some great pieces of legislation. So the Care Act 2014 is generally seen as saying exactly what we might all want social care to be saying, but the implementation has been really poor. And as I said, we've had a care cap passed into law in 2014, but then again in 2022, and that's now been postponed its implementation until after the next general election, which I think we can all agree is generally a euphemism for we will not do that at all. And then obviously in Northern Ireland, we have this sort of sense of that being sort of stalled. And that had not been the kinds of certainly the kind of formal policy changes that we've seen in any of the others. And it's important to recognise as well that this is coming from a fairly low base. So when we presented this in Scotland, people get quite cross because they think it's terrible, and the Scottish government is doing all sorts of awful things, and the private sector is doing all sorts of awful things, and so they didn't like or agree with the characterisation. So I suppose we would just say, well, this is a kind of, it's a kind of ranking of our findings in a context where everybody is struggling. So it's not saying that Scotland has got it sorted. Scotland passed a great Self-Directed Support Act and then just left it to wither. It's recently been kind of had this flagship National Care Service set of proposals, which again have been really now watered down and postponed for 3 years. So Scotland is not, it's not like it's kind of racing ahead on everything, but if you did have to kind of look at the different kind of metrics, you would see that it felt like it was in the strongest position. So in terms of then explaining what we found, and kind of I guess why we felt that Scotland had gone furthest, we looked at these kind of 3 measures of scale, so the sort of size of the policy community, the style of politics, and then this kind of jurisdictional scope. And we felt that partly what was going on is that Scotland had just had the most conducive environment in terms of its constitutional settlement, in terms of its kind of political, the early momentum from the then Labour-led government in Scotland, and then the kind of SNP being in power for a long time, and a kind of very proactive government led by Nicola Sturgeon. But as I said, that's now starting to seem a bit less of a kind of accurate account of what's going on currently in Scotland. Wales and Northern Ireland, I think, obviously have that same, what we kind of call the sort of small government dividend, that some of the comparative literature just show that it's easier to get things done in smaller countries. But yeah, there hasn't been a kind of constitutional and institutional stability to really be able to make the most of that. England, 10 times larger than Scotland in terms of population, has it can be hard to characterise it as England at all. It's got kind of 152 local authorities all doing things slightly differently, and this sense of kind of overload, the distractions of Brexit in terms of the kind of time and space at Westminster, and then the very kind of adversarial general election debates we've had around adult social care. We had that in 2010, and we had it with Theresa May again. 2019 was that? I forget, there's too many. But yeah, the kind of dementia tax, death tax debates, there just doesn't seem to be any sign of a kind of willingness to take this into that more kind of consensus space. And then this reflection from a report from the Institute for Government, around kind of limits of policy learning. So we found in the interviews that people in Wales said that they looked to Scotland. We found a bit of that in the Northern Irish interviews as well. Scotland didn't look to anywhere, they just were off. In fact, yeah, they looked to Sweden and the Nordics for their social democratic utopia, and then England was just doing its own thing, wasn't interested really in what's going on at the periphery. So I thought that was kind of quite interesting around the kind of the patterns. And I think that part of that is kind of reflected in this quote at the bottom, is that there are different parties in control in each, the four. And so that sense it's easier to go to Sweden and speak to somebody there than it is to, if you're in the SNP, to go and speak to the Conservatives or Labour in Wales or whatever. So that was the sort of, I guess we would call that a sort of set of kind of institutional findings around scale, style and scope. And then the second category of explanations is more around what we call the kind of the policy mix, so what's actually in those sort of those 6 mechanisms that we had around professionalise the workforce and integrate with care. And this notion that when you're trying to do a lot of different things all at once, you do have to be attentive to whether they interact and whether they're mutually supportive and they have kind of positive feedback loops, or whether they actually start to kind of pull against each other, because there is this sense that they're working in the system and they have these self-organising properties. So one of the reasons that we argued that Scotland had been more successful was partly because it sort of separated out the different bits of the policy mix into separate bits of legislation. So it brought in free personal care around 2002, it brought in self-directed support in 2012, it then had legislation about integration with care around 2015. So it kind of put a lot of attention onto kind of one area, passed the legislation in that, and then moved on. Now some people from Scotland said the problem is when it moves on, it then forgets that it did self-directed support, because suddenly it's all about integration. So it's not without its problems. But if you look at the Care Act in England and the Social Services and Wellbeing Act in Wales, they were much more kind of portmanteau legislation that tried to do everything: rights for carers, personalisation, more direct payments, a cap on care costs. And there was a sense that possibly some of the unravelling of that was because of this attempt to kind of do everything at once, but not recognising that if you're going to put a cap on care costs, for example, that has enormous consequences for the stability and the viability of your social care provider market, and that has implications for your workforce, and so not thinking attentively enough about the mix of different things that are in this sort of policy basket. And what we argue in the book is that there are actually sort of 2 categories of things in this policy mix. So you can kind of see these best on the next slide. So there are things in the policy mix which are about, let's make social care individualised, local, differentiated, person-centred, let's have as much kind of micro-commissioning, personal assistance. I take a kind of strengths and asset-based approach, which really puts the person at the centre and looks at them as a kind of somebody with strengths rather than as a kind of bundle of needs to be met, and that some of the kind of direction of legislation over 20 years has been about, let's kind of make care more like that. But then simultaneously, we've got this whole kind of set of things going on in social care, which is like, let's make it safer, let's make it more regulated, let's make it more standardised, let's make it more centralised, let's make sure that we can have a kind of regulated workforce, that we get rid of the postcode lottery so everyone kind of gets the same. Let's integrate it with health as much as possible, because we know that there is kind of efficiencies there and we kind of join things up. And what we would argue is that the sort of the tension between these 2 implicit paradigms, which are not really recognised to be in tension with one another, has been one of the reasons really why we've seen this lack of progress around social care, because these kind of things are pulling in different directions. So we might say the kind of move towards direct payments sits on that differentiated side, whereas the move towards free personal care, as in Scotland, is more on that standardised side, because the move towards free personal care means more relatively standardised domiciliary care packages for people. That has, we found in our Scottish interviews, taken attention away from some of the more preventative work, some of the more kind of innovative work, but it has been much more about packages, and that then you're starting to see something which just looks like everybody kind of getting the same, and everybody getting something which is quite functional, rather than about kind of what does it mean for me to have a good life, how can I kind of do that in different sorts of ways. So this was captured, I think, really well in a quote from Nick Watson from Glasgow University when he was giving evidence to the Scottish Parliament about the Feely reports that preceded the Scottish Government's proposals for a National Care Service. And so he's talking here about the Feely report, saying that on the one hand, good social care is about diversity. It's about meeting the needs of the locality and each user. And on the other hand, we see calls in the Feely report for care which is more centralised, more standardised, and giving more institutional power. So I think Patrick and I, when we read that, I was like, yes, that's it. That's exactly, from that one report, really just conveying this sense of there's two things going on here. There's at least two things going on, and unless we kind of acknowledge them and say, well, if we can't do both, or if they put against each other, how might we kind of start to prioritise what is most important? Is it more important, for people to articulate what they kind of want out of care and what might make a good day for them, and allow them to take some kind of risks around that? Or is it more important that everybody is safe and that it's consistent and that everybody can get the same no matter where they live, and that we need to actually be sort of having a bit more of that sort of dialogue? So to conclude then, I think we would say that there has been, something has gone on, or certainly there's been kind of talk of reform in all four areas, and several of them on the kind of brink of further reform. I guess we can get into conversations about what that would look like in Northern Ireland. The National Care Service at one point in Scotland looked like it was all full steam ahead. That's now been delayed for 3 years and looks a bit uncertain with the departure of Nicola Sturgeon, I think. Wales is talking about a national care and support service, and looks like maybe it will be the kind of first mover on that now. The Fabians in England are talking about a national care service, but it's not entirely clear whether that's something that a Labour government, if it was to be elected, would bring in. But there is a sense of kind of some articulations there of a different kind of approach, and something which is a bit more holistic. We would say Scotland's gone furthest, but this is kind of needs to recognise the limits of that. And there's certainly not a clear articulation in any of them about how we might kind of A, recognise them, and B, do something about this sense of sort of tension within the paradigm. I think our kind of findings were that there is a benefit to incrementalism in this space, and I think I have experience about this myself, because I think that kind of articulation of a national care service, if it can bring kind of public support behind it, could be a powerful mechanism for change, because the lack of public interest in social care has been really one of the reasons why politicians have ignored it. So as a kind of mobilising force, maybe that could do something. But I do wonder, and this has really come to pass in Scotland, that if you come up with a big inclusive plan, you just create this massive target for everybody to take aim at, and in the end they've had to sort of, they were going to take care away from local government in Scotland, and now they've kind of given it back to local government. So by the time you've kind of kept all your kind of stakeholders on board, then it kind of starts to look a bit less comprehensive. So there's a debate really there about whether it's best to kind of go for the sort of new beverage idea of a big settlement, or whether it's better to do what Scotland had done in the period of study, which is to take these more incremental steps. And I think generally our feeling was that there's a lot to be said for just getting going, doing something, even this being described as sort of clumsy reform or good enough, rather than waiting. There will be no the kind of whatever there were very distinctive conditions that led to Beveridge and the creation of the welfare state. Those aren't coming back. We can't wait for a new foundational moment necessarily. So let's just get on and do something, and not use that kind of let the perfect be the enemy of the good, because there's some real crisis situations here. We need to come up with some kind of rapid interventions. So just a couple of questions then, just to take us into the question and answer session. So we don't have to talk about these, but I guess these are some of the questions that we're starting to think about in our research, which is partly about how do we support and encourage policymakers to do something around care. So if we just think, a lot of the time we talk about what should be done, but we need as well to talk about how it can be done, and what, how you get policy through, because that's obviously a more kind of political question to some degree. And then how do we kind of think about those two paradigms, and how we might kind of bring them into a kind of recognise the kind of the power of both of them, but not get stuck, not kind of get hung up on the tensions between them, such that we end up with kind of incoherent policy that just can get passed and put on the statute book, but doesn't really improve social care services and lives for people. So I'll leave it there, thank you.